For 72 years, he ruled as if the sun itself obeyed his will. He drained France to build the most extravagant palace on earth. He waged wars that left fields soaked in blood and villages in ashes. He turned Versailles into a golden cage, forcing nobles to bow in humiliating rituals just to be near him. Louis XIV called himself the Sun King, and for decades, the world believed him. But when death came, it stripped away the gold. His body blackened with rot, the air around him thick with decay, and the palace he built became a theater for his slow, pitiless end. Before we begin this story, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this video, and at what time of day? Now, let's begin. The King of France lay imprisoned in his own bed. The Sun King, once the axis on which the world seemed to turn, was shrunken, almost unrecognizable beneath the heavy folds of crimson velvet. His once commanding chest rose and fell with a slow, rasping rhythm, as though each breath required permission from some unseen force. From the shadows, courtiers watched, their faces stiff with etiquette, their eyes darting toward the closed curtains that failed to contain the sour scent of decay. The source of that smell was whispered in the corridors, but never uttered aloud in the royal chamber. Gangrene, black and creeping, was devouring the king's leg, climbing from his foot toward his thigh. Beneath his stockings, the flesh was mottled, swollen, and dead in places. Perfumed air drifted through the open doors, but no fragrance, ambergris, musk, jasmine, could disguise the truth. Death had already entered Versailles. Outside the chamber, Versailles itself still played the part it had been built to perform. The great fountains gushed in precise choreography. Courtiers in brocade whispered political intrigues in manicured gardens. The sound of rustling silk and clicking heels echoed through endless galleries. The palace lived on in its ritual splendor, as if sheer performance could hold reality at bay. But those who passed too near the king's apartments felt the illusion falter. The music dimmed, conversations hushed. Inside, the air was heavier. Candles sputtered in their golden sconces, their flames struggling against the staleness. Physicians hovered like carrion birds in fine lace, murmuring in Latin, their powdered wigs nodding in grave agreement about treatments that would not work. Servants moved silently, their slippers muffled on thick carpets, bringing more incense, more flowers, more draperies, anything to mask the truth that the most powerful man in Europe was rotting from the inside out. Louis himself lay still, his dark eyes fixed on the carved canopy above him. Once, those eyes had held entire armies in their gaze. Once, their glance could make a duke tremble, or a courtier's fortunes soar. Now they seemed fixed on something far away, beyond the painted cherubs, beyond the gilded cornices, staring into some distant, unreachable sky. It was said that when Louis XIV entered a room, the atmosphere changed, as though the very light obeyed his presence. He was the sun, and the court revolved around him. But now the light was retreating. The days felt shorter in Versailles. The dawns were slower to break. Even the mirrors in the hall seemed to dim, reflecting less gold, more shadow. At the edges of the chamber, the nobles whispered. They whispered of omens, strange dreams, sudden storms. They whispered of the king's confessor, urging him to repent. And most of all, they whispered the forbidden question: if the sun dies, what will be left but night? Louis could feel their eyes on him. He could sense their careful observation, the same way a stag feels the gaze of hunters in the forest. He had spent his life mastering the theater of monarchy, turning every glance, every gesture into a performance. But now the theater was slipping from his control. He was no longer the actor. He was the scene. In moments of fevered clarity, he remembered the early years, when his body was strong, when his legs carried him tirelessly from council chambers to hunt, from ballroom to battlefield. He had danced, fenced, and commanded with a vitality that seemed endless. Versailles itself was the monument to that power. Every arch, every fountain, every painted ceiling, a reminder that he, Louis, had bent France to his will. And yet, in this room, surrounded by gilded opulence, he found himself facing the one adversary he could not outmaneuver. Not Spain, not England, not the rebellious nobility. No, this enemy was quiet, unyielding, and certain. The rot in his leg was the rot in the world, and for the first time, he wondered if he had been fighting it all his life without knowing it. A distant bell rang from the palace chapel, its echo rolling through the halls like a cold wind. Somewhere beyond the chamber doors, the ritual of the lever, the king's ceremonial awakening, was beginning without him. Pages carried fresh garments into empty dressing rooms. Musicians tuned their instruments for a court that would not assemble. The machinery of Versailles turned, but without the sun to illuminate it, its gears ground slowly, reluctantly, toward stillness. One of his closest attendants, the Duc de Saint-Simon, would later write of this moment. The king was no longer the king. He was a man, and worse than a man, for he was a man who knew he was dying. And yet Louis did not close his eyes. He stared upward, as though by will alone he might hold the ceiling aloft, keep the clouds from swallowing the light. The world outside might have already begun to prepare for his absence, but in his mind, he was still the sun. And perhaps that was why he refused to fade quietly. For even as the air thickened and the shadows lengthened, the Sun King still believed he could command the heavens. And in that belief lay both his greatness and his doom. The curtain stirred with the faintest draft, carrying with it a whisper of the gardens beyond. The scent was faint, wet earth, fading roses, but it was enough to remind him of a time when he had walked among those blooms, their colors blazing in the sunlight. He imagined himself there, just for a moment, before the pain in his leg pulled him back to the present. From the hallway came the muffled sound of approaching footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, as if the figure beyond the door carried news too heavy to be spoken quickly. Louis's eyes shifted toward the sound. Around the bed, the courtiers straightened, their whispers falling silent. The physicians stepped back. The door opened. A shadow fell across the threshold. The room waited. And in that silence, thick, electric, expectant, the truth began to take form. This was not merely the decline of a man. It was the setting of a sun that had ruled the sky for 72 years. And what would rise in its place was uncertain, perhaps even dangerous. Outside, the clouds thickened over Versailles. The light dimmed further, and deep within the palace, as the courtiers held their breath, the question none dared to voice took root in every mind. If the sun dies, will the world ever see morning again? The thought lingered in the corridors, weaving between tapestries and echoing in marble halls. It was a paradox. How could the man who had outlived rivals, dynasties, and even his own children now lie powerless, trapped in a body that had once seemed immortal? The corridors of Versailles had grown accustomed to the sound of his footsteps. For decades, their rhythm had been the heartbeat of France, measured, deliberate, certain. To hear those steps was to know that the machinery of state still turned. And yet now, in the late summer of 1715, those footsteps were absent. The silence was deafening. Louis XIV had lived so long that the idea of his death felt unnatural, almost absurd. He had outlasted enemies who swore they would bury him, outlived his own sons and grandsons, and watched entire generations of courtiers arrive, age, and vanish like candles, burning down in the wind. His reign had not merely spanned an era, it had defined it. For those born under his rule, the Sun King was as permanent as the stones of Versailles itself. To imagine a France without him was like imagining a world without the sun. But the paradox was cruel. The longer he lived, the more unthinkable his death became. And yet, the same body that had weathered decades of war councils, grand balls, relentless hunts, and exhausting ceremonies was now surrendering. Not in a blaze of glory, but in the slow, humiliating collapse of flesh. His body, once a symbol of divine right and kingly authority, was betraying him in the most undignified manner possible. In his youth, Louis had cultivated an image of health and beauty so meticulous it bordered on obsession. His daily routines were performances, the public dressing, rituals, the measured walks in the gardens, the feasts where he ate sparingly to appear in control of appetite. His skin was powdered to perfection. His hair, real or carefully arranged wigs, framed his face like a golden halo. But now that halo was dimmed, powder could not hide the sallowness beneath his eyes. Wigs sat awkwardly on a head that seemed to have shrunk. His courtiers saw it, and they could not unsee it. Men and women who once trembled at his glance now began to exchange brief, sharp looks when they thought he wasn't watching. Calculations were already forming in their minds. Who would hold power in a France without him? Whose fortunes would rise? Whose would be swept away when the inevitable came? The paradox cut deeper than mere politics. Louis had been both the anchor and the chain for his kingdom. His presence gave stability, a familiar, unyielding order that kept chaos at bay. But that same presence suffocated change, froze progress, and forced every ambition to orbit around his will. With his living corpse now occupying the throne, that stability began to decay. The rot in his leg had its reflection in the state itself, slow, creeping, and impossible to stop. At night, when the corridors were empty and the last court musicians had packed away their instruments, the king's apartments were filled with another kind of music, the steady tick of clocks. Louis had filled Versailles with them, their intricate mechanisms a reflection of his obsession with control. He had been a master of time, dictating every hour of the court's existence. But now, in the darkness, each tick seemed louder, a reminder that time belonged to no one, not even a king who had outshone all others. The physicians still pretended hope. They recommended hot compresses, scented poultices, exotic unguents imported at vast expense. They suggested bloodletting one day and feeding him more meat the next. Each remedy was presented with the same solemnity as a battle plan, and each failed. Their voices, once confident, had grown quieter. Even their footsteps into his chamber seemed slower, as though they feared to draw attention to their own helplessness. Louis felt it too. He could sense the edges of his power fraying. His commands were still obeyed, but not with the same urgency. His audiences with ministers grew shorter. Conversations were punctuated by pauses, not for reflection, but for the king to catch his breath. He began to notice how often people stood just a little farther from his bed than before, as if keeping their distance from the stench of death. And yet, some part of him still believed in his invincibility. This was the cruelest element of the paradox. His mind clung to the idea that he could not die, even as his body betrayed him at every turn. How could the sun set? It had never happened before. Surely it could not happen now. This illusion was fed by the palace itself. Versailles had been constructed not only to house the king, but to reflect his permanence. Its gardens stretched in perfect symmetry toward the horizon, as though the world itself bent to his vision. Its ceilings were painted with gods and victories, each brushstroke declaring that Louis's reign was eternal. And yet, beneath those same ceilings, the air was thick with the smell of putrefying flesh. Mortality was seeping in through the cracks like a cold winter draft. There were moments when the Sun King's pride pierced through the haze of sickness. When he sat up in bed, summoning ministers to discuss military reports or trade negotiations, he would speak as though nothing had changed. His words still carried weight. The room still fell silent at their sound. But once the ministers left, the mask slipped. His shoulders sagged, his breathing quickened, and the golden illusion dissolved again into the gray reality of a dying man. In the private hours, he confronted thoughts he had long ignored. He remembered the early losses, his mother, his brother, his beloved queen. He thought of the children he had buried, the heirs who had been groomed for the throne only to die before they could sit upon it. The throne itself seemed cursed, a seat too heavy for any mortal man to bear for long. Perhaps his own longevity had been less a blessing than a sentence. The court outside his chamber was alive with a new kind of energy, not the brilliance of festivities, but the feverish hum of ambition. The younger courtiers, born long after his coronation, whispered names of potential regents and allies. The older ones moved with a calculated patience, careful not to appear eager. Alliances shifted in shadows. A smile here, a nod there. The small transactions of power that happen when the center of authority begins to weaken. In these moments, Louis understood that the true danger was not his death, but the instability it would unleash. Without his iron grip, the factions would tear at one another. France could fracture. He thought of his own words, spoken in confidence to his heir long ago. The crown is a fire, too bright for some to bear, too hot for others to hold. Yet the fire was going out, and those who had warmed themselves in its light were already reaching for tinder and flint. The paradox was closing in on him. He was too alive for the court to mourn him, yet too close to death for them to obey him with the old reverence. He existed in a strange limbo, a living symbol of a reign that was already in some ways over. The king and the state had been one. Now both were beginning to drift apart. One evening, as the sun set behind the palace gardens, a shaft of light entered his chamber, striking the gold embroidery on his coverlet. For a moment, it seemed as though the Sun King was once again bathed in his namesake's glow. But the light was fleeting. The clouds closed in. The golden threads faded to dull brown in the growing dusk. In that fading light, Louis realized the truth that had been stalking him for months. Even the sun must set. And as the shadows lengthened over Versailles, the palace itself began to reveal its true nature. Not merely a monument to glory, but a gilded cage that would hold its king until the very end. The palace stood as if carved from sunlight, an endless expanse of gold and marble, its grand facade stretching across the horizon like the very embodiment of power. But Versailles was never merely a home. It was a stage, a weapon, and most insidiously, a trap. From the moment a noble stepped through its gates, they entered a world designed to ensnare. Every hallway was a theater set, every chamber a carefully crafted scene. The walls themselves seemed to whisper reminders of the king's supremacy, murals of celestial triumph, statues of gods with faces eerily resembling his own. Louis XIV had constructed Versailles not only to impress foreign dignitaries, but to bind the French nobility to him in chains of etiquette and ceremony. In his prime, it had worked flawlessly. Courtiers revolved around the Sun King like planets around a star, their days consumed by rituals that seemed to affirm his divinity. The lover, the coucher, the endless procession of meals, hunts, and audiences, all of it designed so that no rival could rise without being seen. No conspiracy could form without being suffocated in silk and gold. But now, in the twilight of his life, this vast golden labyrinth had turned inward on its creator. The rooms that once amplified his glory now magnified his suffering. The king's bedchamber was the epicenter of this transformation. Draped in crimson and gold, it had once been the stage for his most calculated performances. The ritual of his awakening, when select courtiers were permitted to watch him dress, symbolically bringing the sun into the world each morning. Now the same chamber smelled of illness. Thick clouds of incense hung in the air, curling around the gilded bedposts in a futile attempt to mask the sickly sweet stench of his decaying leg. The perfume of amber and rosewater could not disguise it. The scent was stubborn, clinging to velvet curtains and lingering in the hair of those who entered. Servants scrubbed the parquet floors until they gleamed like mirrors, but they could not scrub away the heaviness in the air. The sound of their work, cloth on wood, the faint slosh of water, was punctuated by the king's labored breathing. Even the crackle of the fireplace seemed subdued, as if reluctant to draw attention to itself. Still, the lever continued. At dawn, the chosen few entered in solemn procession, bowing low, their movements choreographed as they had been for decades. But the performance had changed. The monarch who once rose with theatrical grace now struggled to lift his head from the pillows. Each gesture, the extension of an arm, the turning of his head, seemed to cost him more than a battle might have in his youth. And yet, the ritual persisted. Not because it brought the king strength, but because Versailles itself demanded it. The palace was an organism that fed on ceremony. Without it, the illusion might falter, and the truth that the Sun King was dimming would become impossible to ignore. Outside his chamber, life went on with unnerving normality. In the gardens, fountains leapt into the air in glittering arcs. Musicians played in salons. Courtiers gossiped in mirrored galleries. But their eyes, when they glanced toward the king's apartments, betrayed the truth. They knew the sun was setting. Some came to the lever, not out of loyalty, but out of curiosity. To see the body of a god brought low, to witness history bending toward its end. Versailles itself seemed to conspire in this theater of decline. The same architectural marvels that once projected Louis's vitality now trapped him in a gilded prison. The Hall of Mirrors reflected not just light, but the frailty of its master. The endless corridors, designed to keep the nobility near, now seemed to lead only to one destination: the king's bed, where power lay dying in slow motion. The paradox was cruel. The palace was built to make Louis eternal, yet in his final days, it became the frame for his mortality. Every candlelit ceremony, every bow, every carefully timed meal drew attention not to his grandeur, but to the fact that it was fading. Inside, time moved strangely. Hours stretched long between physician visits, days blurred together, marked only by the changing bouquets brought in to mask the smell. Lilies one morning, lavender the next. The flowers wilted quickly in the stifling air, their fragrance mingling with that of decay until the two became indistinguishable. Louis could feel the palace pressing in on him. The very walls seemed to lean closer, as though Versailles were watching, recording, storing every moment of his suffering for posterity. He had once loved the attention. Now it was suffocating. The gold leaf on the furniture caught the candlelight, dazzling and oppressive, as if mocking him with the permanence he could not possess. Yet even in this state, the king maintained a certain composure. He insisted that the ceremonies continue, that the nobles be admitted as always. Perhaps he hoped that by clinging to the forms of power, he could delay the reality of its loss. Or perhaps he understood that to end the ritual was to announce his surrender, and surrender was something Louis XIV had never known. At times, when the chamber doors were closed and only a handful of trusted attendants remained, his mask would slip. The king's eyes would wander to the ceiling, tracing the painted allegories of victory and divine favor. He would murmur names from the past, mistresses, ministers, generals, as if summoning them back to his side. Those moments passed quickly, swallowed by the next wave of visitors, but they were enough to remind the few who witnessed them that beneath the sun, King's grandeur was a man grappling with the approach of darkness. Even the most loyal courtiers could not ignore the change. They watched the way he winced when shifting in bed, the way his voice faltered after a few sentences. They heard the faint hiss of pain he could not quite suppress when his leg was moved for cleaning. And though they bowed as deeply as ever, their minds were already turning to the question of succession. Still, the palace played its part. The curtains in the bedchamber remained heavy and lush. The silverware at his bedside gleamed, and the portraits on the walls showed a king untouched by time. Versailles in its perfection, refused to age, even as its master withered within it. In the gardens, the grand axis stretched toward the horizon, as if promising infinity. From his bed, Louis could see a sliver of that view through the open doors. It was a cruel reminder. The world outside was still in motion, still beautiful, still bathed in sunlight, while he lay here, a prisoner of his own creation. The lever would happen again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, as long as he breathed. The courtiers would file in, the curtains would be drawn, the perfumes uncorked, the bows performed. But beneath it all, the truth lingered, heavy and undeniable. Versailles was no longer his theater of triumph. It was his cage, and he would never leave it alive. And in that cage, behind the curtains and the clouds of incense, something darker was taking root, a creeping, silent corruption that no ritual could drive away. It began as a whisper of discomfort, a dull ache in his left leg, easily ignored in the bustle of royal routine. Louis XIV had weathered far worse over the years: fevers, injuries, the lingering exhaustion of war. A soreness in the calf was nothing to a man who had ruled for more than 7 decades. The court physicians agreed. A mild inflammation, they said, perhaps the residue of a hunting strain or a touch of the gout that had long troubled him. They prescribed hot compresses, herbal salves, and rest. Louis followed their advice, not out of faith in their skill, but because such minor ailments had always yielded to time and discipline. But this time, the pain did not fade. It deepened. It spread. Within weeks, the discomfort became a persistent throb, and then an agony that flared with each movement. By the end of summer, the king could no longer stand without assistance. His steps, once deliberate and commanding, became halting. The Sun King, whose mere stride through the Hall of Mirrors had been an event, was now confined to his bed for long hours. And then the color changed. The skin of his leg darkened, first to a deep purple, then to a sickening black. The flesh felt cold and hard in patches, as though the life inside it had been snuffed out. Physicians now murmured a single word, gangreina, but never within earshot of the king. Gangrene was not an ailment to be cured. It was a sentence. The smell came next. At first, it was a faint metallic tang, noticeable only when the leg was uncovered. Then, as the weeks wore on, it thickened into something heavier, a cloying, sickly sweet stench that clung to everything in the room. Perfume was poured over linens, incense burned day and night, bowls of fresh lavender and roses placed beside the bed. Nothing worked. The odors seeped into the curtains, the carpets, the wigs and garments of anyone who lingered too long in his presence. To be near the king now was to carry a trace of death on one's clothes. The physicians tried what they could. They lanced blisters, drained fluids, applied poultices of wine and herbs. At last, desperate, they cut away dead flesh with knives so sharp they hissed against bone. No anesthetic dulled the pain. Louis gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles whitened, his face a mask of impassivity. Not a cry escaped him, though those close enough could see the tendons in his neck straining, as if to keep the sound contained. The court, however, did not need to hear the king's screams to know the truth. The whispers had already begun. In the salons, over glasses of fortified wine, they spoke of it in hushed tones. The Sun King is rotting while he still breathes. The phrase passed from mouth to mouth, carried on the same air that held the faint scent of decay. Some claimed to have seen the blackened flesh themselves. Others exaggerated the tale until it bordered on horror stories told to frighten children. But the core of it was true. The king's body was being consumed from within. And with that, truth came fear. Courtiers began to find reasons not to linger in the king's chamber. They arrived late for the lever, left early after the cowsher. Even those who adored him kept a careful distance, not from disrespect, but from an instinctive aversion to the visible, undeniable reminder that all flesh fails. The Sun King had spent his reign cultivating the illusion of divine vitality. Now his body was the enemy of that illusion. Louis felt it too. In the rare moments when the pain subsided enough for thought, he turned the matter over in his mind. The rot in his leg was not just an infection. It was a mirror. France itself bore wounds that festered beneath the gilded surface. War debts that bled the treasury dry, famines that blackened the countryside, court intrigues that ate at the stability he had so carefully built. The disease in his flesh was the disease in his realm, slow, inexorable, and perhaps beyond saving. Sometimes in the feverish haze of night, he thought he could hear it, the quiet gnawing of decay, the sound of himself being unmade one cell at a time. In those moments, the walls of Versailles seemed to close in, the incense turned suffocating, and the murmured Latin of his physicians like the chanting of priests at a funeral. The treatments grew more brutal. One morning, they tried cauterization, pressing hot iron to the wound in a desperate attempt to stop the spread. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the already foul air. Some attendants fainted. Others fled the room entirely. Louis endured it in silence, though sweat poured from his brow, and for the first time, his jaw trembled. When the procedure ended, the leg looked worse. Angry red where it was not black, swollen and oozing where it had been cut. The physicians exchanged glances that needed no words. They knew, and perhaps the king knew too, that this was not the path to recovery. Outside his chamber, the life of the court went on, but the energy was different. Where once there had been awe, now there was anticipation, the morbid curiosity of those waiting for the inevitable. Ministers drafted plans for regency. Nobles tightened alliances. Foreign envoys sent coded messages to their masters. All the while, the king lay in bed, his empire still outwardly whole, but, like his leg, darkening at the edges. Some nights, he dreamed of battlefields, of the acrid smoke of gunpowder and the cries of wounded men. He woke to find the smell of his own body overpowering even those imagined scenes. Death was not coming for him in the heroic form of war. It was creeping toward his heart from the bottom of his leg, inch by inch, day by day. By late August, the blackness had reached his knee. The pain was constant. The skin stretched tight and shiny over swelling. The only relief came when the limb was elevated, and even then it was fleeting. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his bed and the narrow view through the chamber doors, a glimpse of corridors he could no longer walk, of courtiers he could no longer chase with his gaze. And yet, the rituals persisted. The lever still brought the select few to his bedside, though they now stood farther away. The incense still burned, though it no longer masked the truth. Versailles still glittered, though its master was fading. The rot was winning. And as the decay spread through the king's body, it began to infect the very air of Versailles, turning ritual into spectacle, and his dying into the court's most morbid entertainment. Versailles had always been a theater. Its corridors, its salons, its gardens, all stages upon which the drama of monarchy unfolded. But never had its performance been so macabre, so intimate, as in the summer of 1715, when the Sun King lay dying. Louis XIV did not die in private. He could not. Privacy was a luxury he had stripped from himself decades earlier, replacing it with spectacle. Every hour of his day had been a public ritual, from the lever when his waking was attended by the highest-ranked nobles, to the cowsher when the extinguishing of his candle was witnessed as if it were a liturgy. Now in his final act, the audience remained. They gathered at the edges of his bedchamber like shadows, their silks whispering against the polished floors. They watched the movements of the royal physicians. the trembling hands of servants changing the bandages on his rotting leg, the slow rise and fall of his chest. Every grimace, every flicker of pain that passed across his face was noted and passed along in murmured reports through the palace. The etiquette was absolute. The king's suffering must be observed just as his triumphs had been. A monarch of such grandeur could not slip quietly into death. His passing must be a mirror of his reign, deliberate, ceremonial, and witnessed by those whose very existence was bound to his. But the performance was beginning to slip. Some courtiers stood with tears in their eyes, genuine or otherwise. They dabbed at their cheeks with lace handkerchiefs and whispered prayers under their breath. Others lingered in doorways, speaking in low voices of debts to be settled, alliances to be struck, power to be seized when the inevitable came. Ministers passed through the chamber with their heads bowed, yet in alcoves and side rooms they leaned together, voices sharp with the urgency of succession planning. It was not lost on Louis. He had designed Versailles to function in this way, a place where loyalty and ambition were kept in constant tension, where the nobility's every move was visible to the crown. He knew they were watching him, cataloging every moment of his decline as though it were a court entertainment. And in a sense, it was. The king's chamber had become both chapel and marketplace. At the foot of his bed, his confessor murmured of salvation, urging the monarch to cleanse his soul before meeting God. But a few steps away, counselors whispered of regency councils and military garrisons, of treaties and tax reforms. The air itself seemed divided, part incense, part intrigue. Louis lay still, staring at the gilt ceiling above him. Painted there were scenes of divine glory, cherubs scattering golden light, gods bestowing crowns. Once, he had taken comfort in those images. Now they seemed like a cruel joke. The ceiling had not changed, but he had. The man beneath the gold leaf was no longer the unshakable figure the painting celebrated. He was pale, hollow-cheeked, and tethered to the world by breath alone. From time to time, he would turn his head toward the gathered courtiers. Some would lower their eyes respectfully. Others held his gaze, as if to measure just how close he was to the end. He could read the calculations in their faces, the careful balance of mourning and anticipation. In quieter hours, when the chamber thinned to only a handful of attendants, Louis spoke in fragments. To one minister, he muttered instructions about the young heir. To a priest, he confessed sins long kept silent. Once to a childhood friend, he whispered a question so softly it was barely heard. Will they remember me for my glory or for my decay? No one answered. The days blurred together. Morning and night were marked not by the sun, but by the endless cycle of visits. Pages entered with letters from distant generals. Ambassadors sought audiences, their expressions grave, but their eyes sharp. Even foreign dignitaries, sensing the shifting tides, arrived under the guise of concern to witness the king's failing with their own eyes. Versailles was a cage, yes, but it was also a gallery, and the king himself the principal exhibit. Not all who came were respectful. In hidden corners there were smiles, quick, almost guilty, but smiles nonetheless. For some, Louis's death would mean release from the suffocating etiquette he had enforced. Others saw in it the chance to climb higher, to claim titles and lands long out of reach. To them, his suffering was not a tragedy, but the slow turning of a key in a locked door. Louis saw that too, and it wounded him in a way the gangrene could not. The body could be numbed, the leg could be bandaged, but the knowledge that the court was already living in the shadow of his absence, that they were rehearsing life without him, was a pain no surgeon could cut away. Yet still, the ritual continued. Every meal, no matter how small his appetite, was served with the same ceremony. Every audience, even if he could manage only a few words, was conducted as though the machinery of the state still turned effortlessly around him. Perhaps he clung to these forms not to convince the court, but to convince himself that he was still the Sun King, not yet the extinguished star they were preparing to bury. In the evenings, candles were lit until the room glowed with an almost unnatural brightness. Shadows clung to the corners, pushed back by the warm light, but never entirely banished. The courtiers stood like statues in that glow, watching, always watching. Versailles had become a single, vast, silent auditorium, and Louis XIV, trapped in his bed, could only wonder, would the spectacle survive the man? Or would it dissolve the moment his eyes closed, leaving the palace an empty stage, the golden mask lying discarded in the dust? The answer, he feared, lay just beyond the reach of his remaining days. And so, as the theater of his dying played on before the court's restless eyes, Louis felt the full weight of the years he had ruled, decades of victories and vanities, now pressing upon him in the silence between breaths. The splendor of his reign had been without equal, but so too would be the reckoning. The candles burned low in the king's chamber, their flames bending and trembling in the still air, casting long, wavering shadows across the gilt moldings. Beyond the heavy curtains, Versailles slept, or pretended to. The gardens were silent, the fountains stilled for the night, the great halls emptied of music. But in this one room, there was no rest. Louis XIV lay half upright against a mountain of pillows, his breath shallow, his skin the pale hue of old parchment. In the dim light, he looked not like the Sun King, but like a man half carved from wax, his features softened by exhaustion. His eyes sunk deep into shadow. He had outlasted them all. For 72 years, his word had been France's heartbeat, dictating the rhythm of war and peace, famine and feast, life and death. No other monarch in European history had ruled for so long. And yet, in the stillness of those final nights, it was not the triumphs he felt pressing upon him, but the weight of everything that had been lost in the name of his glory. He closed his eyes, and the room seemed to dissolve. The laughter of mistresses past drifted faintly to his ears, playful, silken, and distant, like voices heard through water. But behind that laughter came other sounds, the sharp, sudden cries of soldiers falling on distant battlefields, the cannon's dull thunder rolling across the plains, the final, ragged breaths of men who had died for his ambitions. He saw them in flickers, faces pale with frost at Blenheim, hands clutched over wounds at Ramillies, eyes wide in disbelief at Malplaquet. In his youth, these images had been fleeting, brushed aside as necessary costs of kingship. But now they lingered, slow and heavy, as though each death had been waiting for its turn to be acknowledged. And the soldiers were not alone. Other faces came forward in the darkness, peasants bent over barren fields, their spines curved like sickles, mothers holding lifeless infants, victims of famine or fever, towns reduced to smoldering rubble by the long wars he had waged. He heard their voices too, low, pleading, bitter. Some nights, his confessor would kneel at his bedside, murmuring words of absolution, as the king confessed in hushed tones. But there were other confessions, spoken not to the priest, but to the corners of the room, to the shadows that gathered there as though listening. "I should have ended the war sooner," he whispered once, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the hearth. "I should have spared them." On another night, "I taxed them until there was nothing left. I thought they could bear it. I thought they could bear anything." The attendants who heard these mutterings said nothing. They bowed, adjusted his blankets, and withdrew without comment. The court saw only a dying king. They could not see the visions that kept him awake. At times, Louis's eyes would follow shapes no one else could see. A flicker in the shadows might draw a faint smile or a sudden tightening of his jaw. Once, in the quiet hours before dawn, he extended a trembling hand toward the empty air, as if reaching for someone unseen. When no hand met his, he let it fall back to the bed, his fingers curling weakly into the sheets. The ghosts were not always accusatory. Some came with warmth, a familiar perfume, a remembered touch. His queen, Marie-Thérèse, appeared in these visions more than once, her gentle face framed by the same dark hair she'd worn on their wedding day. She never spoke in these moments, but the king seemed to listen all the same, his expression softening in a way that startled those who saw it. And then there were the faces of his children, so many of them lost before their time. The Dauphin taken by smallpox, the Duke of Burgundy claimed by measles, the little ones who had died in infancy, their names barely recorded in the vast annals of his reign. He had buried heirs as other men buried coin, reluctantly but repeatedly, as though the supply might never run out. Now he understood that each loss had been irreplaceable. The memories came unbidden, carrying with them a strange kind of reckoning. In the half-light, he could feel the decades pressing against his chest like a physical weight, each year another stone in the edifice of his rule. The splendor had been real, yes. The festivals, the victories, the golden fountains leaping in the sun. But so had the cost. And in these final nights, the two seemed inseparable. Beauty and ruin bound together like the warp and weft of a tapestry. Occasionally he spoke of the years aloud, as if sorting them in his mind. 72, he murmured once, eyes fixed on the play of candlelight on the ceiling. 72 years, and still I do not know if I have built a kingdom, or merely a stage. The courtiers who visited him now came more from duty than devotion. They stood in stiff lines at the edges of the chamber, bowing when addressed, offering polite platitudes about his recovery. But their eyes betrayed the truth. They were already looking beyond him, into the uncertain landscape of France without its son. Louis could feel their distance, and it deepened his solitude. The solitude did not frighten him. He had known it all his life. Kingship was, in its own way, a kind of isolation. But this solitude felt different. It was not the lofty distance of power, but the hollowed quiet of a man standing at the end of all roads. In these hours, the sounds of the palace seemed to reach him more clearly. The faint scurry of mice in the paneling, the low murmur of guards outside the door, the far-off toll of a bell marking the hour. Each sound felt like a thread tugging at the fabric of the world he had woven, a reminder that the world would go on, perhaps unchanged, perhaps entirely remade, when he was gone. Once near midnight, a storm broke over Versailles. Rain lashed the windows, thunder rolled across the sky, and for a moment the king's eyes widened, as if recognizing something in the chaos outside. "It sounds like war," he said to no one in particular. Then, almost smiling, he added, "Or judgment." No one replied. The attendants kept their heads bowed, pretending not to hear. The storm passed. The candles guttered. The visions returned. By the end of August, the king's voice had grown so soft that even those nearest his bed had to lean close to catch his words. He spoke less of politics now, and more of absolution, of the need to set his affairs not just in the realm, but in his soul. And yet, even as he sought peace, he carried the unshakable bearing of a monarch, a strange, stubborn dignity that clung to him like the faint scent of the incense that burned day and night. It was in these nights that the true paradox of his reign became clear, at least to himself, that he had been both the architect and the captive of his own glory, the master of a kingdom whose splendor would always be shadowed by the suffering it had cost. And as the weight of 72 years pressed down upon him, he seemed to understand, perhaps for the first time, that even the sun must answer for the shadows it casts. And outside his chamber, those shadows were already lengthening, creeping through the corridors of Versailles, carried in whispers of succession ambition, and the dangerous uncertainty of a France without its sun. The corridors of Versailles had grown colder, not in temperature. The fireplaces still burned, the candles still shed their gold light, but in atmosphere. The warmth that once radiated from the presence of the Sun King had begun to thin, replaced by a restless chill. Somewhere beyond the curtained doors of the royal chamber, France's future was being bartered in low voices. The Dauphin was gone. The Duke of Burgundy was gone. Those who should have been the natural heirs to the crown lay in tombs, their deaths another cruel twist in a reign marked by longevity on the throne, but fragility in its bloodline. In their place, the succession had narrowed to a single fragile thread. A 5-year-old boy, the king's great-grandson, small enough to be lifted by one arm, delicate enough that the wrong cough could end him. And so the palace had become a hunting ground. By day, the marble galleries still gleamed, and the hall of mirrors still reflected its rows of chandeliers. But by night, the vastness of Versailles transformed into a warren of quiet plotting. Candlelit rooms hosted small knots of power brokers, dukes, ministers, cardinals, leaning close across polished tables, their words too quiet to echo. Old grudges kept under polite wraps for decades began to resurface. One family sought to erase another from the Regency Council. Allies whispered promises, each laced with the unspoken threat of betrayal. Secret letters changed hands in the shadows. Couriers slipped out under moonlight toward Paris or toward foreign embassies, bearing messages coded in careful phrases. Across Europe, kings and princes waited like vultures circling above a dying beast, each hoping to claim a scrap of land, a treaty, an alliance in the vacuum that would follow the Sun King's death. In the midst of this silent scramble for advantage, the doctors continued their charade. They approached the king's bed each morning with hopeful expressions, as if the rot in his leg might suddenly reverse, as if 72 years of rule could be prolonged by poultices and prayers. They spoke of improvement when there was none, their optimism a flimsy curtain between the chamber and the truth. Louis XIV, however, could not be fooled. He had ruled too long, seen too many faces lie with too much grace, to mistake pretense for hope. The moment the physicians stepped out of his line of sight, he could hear the tone of their voices shift, the clipped, professional politeness giving way to resignation. But the most damning sound was not in his chamber, it was beyond it. Through the heavy drapes, through the thick oak doors, he could hear them, the whispers. He did not need to make out the words. The cadence alone told him their nature. It was the rhythm of deal-making, the sharp, deliberate pauses of strategy, the quickening of voices when opportunity presented itself. It was the same music he had once conducted himself, but now it played without him. He knew the scent of ambition when he smelled it. Versailles, for all its perfumes of amber and rose, could never mask it. It had a quality all its own, metallic, like the tang of coin, acrid, like smoke after battle. In his youth, he had used it, cultivated it, bent it to his will. Now it moved freely in the corridors, unrestrained, coiling toward the throne like ivy reaching for a crack in the stone. Some nights, when the palace was quiet, he imagined he could see it, a pale, formless mist drifting under his chamber door, seeping in along the floorboards. It curled around the bedposts, slid across the blankets, and lingered near his face. The smell was sharper than the stench of his rotting flesh, sharper even than the incense burned to disguise it. In those moments, the truth came into focus. The moment his heart stopped, France would be torn open like a carcass in the field. The strongest would feast first. The rest would pick over the bones. The child heir would be the center of it all. The boy's small form, his soft voice, his untested will, these would be surrounded by men and women with sharper claws than any battlefield foe. Regency was a word spoken carefully, But it meant only one thing in practice: a scramble for the crown without wearing it. Foreign ambassadors watched this unfolding theater with keen interest. In salons and embassies, they weighed each faction, noting which duke or cardinal might be swayed with promises of gold or territory. They sent reports back to Vienna, to Madrid, to London, each line an assessment of how France might be weakened, divided, or bound by treaty in the aftermath. Even the church had its stake. Cardinals whispered with ministers, ensuring their influence would remain steady or grow under the regency. Some hinted that the kingdom's moral compass must be restored after years of court excess. Others were more interested in preserving their estates and privileges. Louis lay listening to all of it. He was not naive. He had orchestrated such maneuvers himself when others had been in decline. He knew the way alliances shifted when the scent of death was in the air. But what stung most was not the ambition itself. It was that it moved without him now. The Sun King had been the axis. All things had revolved around his will. Now the wheel spun without its hub. Occasionally, a minister or family member would attempt to reassure him. "Your Majesty," they would say, "France will stand firm. The council will ensure the boy's safety. All will be well." But their eyes slid away as they spoke, betraying the uncertainty that gnawed at them. He did not answer. Instead, he would turn his gaze toward the ceiling, to the painted heavens that had presided over so many of his triumphs. They looked down at him now, unblinking, offering no counsel. He wondered whether the same gods who had crowned him in glory would watch as the kingdom splintered in his absence. On one particular night, when the palace corridors had gone still, Louis asked for the curtains to be drawn back. He looked out into the darkness beyond Versailles, toward the unseen streets of Paris, the fields, the rivers, the villages. Somewhere out there, peasants slept in wooden beds, merchants locked their shutters, soldiers kept watch at border posts. They did not yet know how quickly their world could change. How, with the death of one man, the center could give way and everything collapse inward. He thought of his own childhood, when France had been torn by the Fronde, that chaotic rebellion of nobles and citizens against the crown. He remembered the fear, the instability, the way power had slipped like water through the fingers of those too weak to hold it. He had sworn never to let France return to that. And yet, lying in his bed, he wondered if the tide was already turning. The whispers grew louder in the days that followed, not in volume, but in number. More rooms, more gatherings, more small clusters of men and women speaking with their heads close together. Even the sound of their laughter, dry, calculated, carried through the marble halls like the rustle of wings in a dark forest. Louis knew then that his death would not bring a clean handover of power. It would bring a feeding frenzy. And though he had prepared for every kind of war in life, he knew he would not be here to fight this one. And so, as the corridors filled with the quiet rustle of ambition, the king's chamber became the last place where time seemed to slow, where the final hours of the Sun King's life counted down to the moment the light would vanish and the scramble in the dark would truly begin. The night before the end was unnervingly still. The corridors of Versailles, normally a hive of murmurs and footfalls, seemed to hold their breath. Even the candles burned lower, their flames steady, reluctant to flicker. The air was heavy with incense, its sweetness almost cloying, mingling with the lingering scent of sickness that no amount of perfume could disguise. Inside the king's chamber, the crowd had grown. Ministers, courtiers, bishops, and members of the royal household pressed themselves along the walls, faces half lit by the candlelight. Their shadows stretched long across the parquet floor, crossing and mingling like the tangled lines of alliances and enmities that had defined the court. Louis XIV lay propped against a mound of embroidered pillows, his skin drawn tight over his bones, his lips dry and pale. The once imposing figure, the man who had ridden at the head of armies, who had danced in the glittering halls he built, was reduced now to a frail silhouette beneath the weight of the bedclothes. His breath came shallow, a faint rasp that seemed to scrape the air from his lungs. Outside the tall windows, the gardens lay under a gray morning sky. The fountains were stilled, their usual music silenced. The Sun King had not seen their waters for weeks, but now it seemed the fountains too awaited his final moment. Those gathered in the chamber knew they were witnessing history. Some prayed, lips moving soundlessly, eyes fixed on crucifixes or folded hands. Others simply stared, their faces masks of solemnity. A few, careful not to be noticed, glanced at one another. A silent exchange of calculations, of futures being weighed in real time. It was then that Louis stirred. His eyes opened, dark and lucid for the first time in days. The crowd leaned in, sensing the moment. His voice, though thin, was deliberate, carrying enough strength to command the room one last time. Je m'en vais, mais l'état demeurera toujours. I am going, but the state will always remain. Then, after a pause, he turned to where the small heir, his great-grandson, was being held by attendants, too young to understand the weight of the crown. The Sun King's gaze softened, and in a voice low but clear, he spoke his final counsel. Do not imitate me in my taste for building and for war. Try to relieve the burdens of your people, which I have not been able to do. It was not quite a confession, not quite an apology, but it was an admission, a recognition that for all the gold and grandeur, for all the victories and pageantry, there had been failures, too deep to ignore at the threshold of death. The silence in the chamber thickened. Those words, sparse and unadorned, seemed to linger in the air longer than any decree he had ever spoken. His breathing slowed. Each exhalation was shallower than the last, the rhythm faltering like the fading toll of a distant bell. Those closest to the bed could hear a faint rattling in his chest, a last stubborn resistance to the inevitable. And then, without ceremony, it came. One final breath, one final release. The Sun King was gone. For a moment, no one moved. The world seemed to tilt into stillness, the air itself holding its shape as if unwilling to collapse into the void he left behind. Then, slowly, the sounds returned. The shuffle of feet, the faint sob of a woman somewhere in the back of the chamber, the creak of leather as men straightened their postures. Outside, the bells began to toll. Their peals rolled out across the gardens, over the rooftops, through the forests, and into the distant villages. Paris would soon hear them, and beyond Paris, all of France. The nation would know its sun had set. Inside the room, the reactions were as divided as the court itself. Some wept openly, tears streaking their powdered cheeks. Others lowered their heads in solemn respect, though their thoughts were already elsewhere. On the Regency Council, on the shifting tides of power, on the opportunities that death always leaves in its wake. The bishops began to murmur prayers for the soul of the departed king. Ministers exchanged brief nods. A few courtiers slipped quietly from the room, their absence noticed only by those who understood the urgency of moving quickly in times like these. The body was arranged with care, the bedclothes smoothed, the king's hands folded neatly upon his chest. In the stillness of death, his features seemed to regain a trace of the authority they had once commanded. But there was no hiding the truth. The force that had held Versailles and France in orbit for 72 years had evaporated into the cold September air. Beyond the chamber, the palace felt different already. The corridors, stripped of their anchor, seemed suddenly hollow. Footsteps echoed more sharply. The gilded walls, the painted ceilings, the endless mirrors, all remained as they were, yet without the man whose will had animated them, they seemed less alive, as though they were only waiting to be claimed by a new order. In that moment, the reign that had shaped Europe collapsed into silence. Treaties, wars, revolutions, all the threads that Louis XIV had held in his grasp slipped free. The empire he had defined now stood untethered, its future uncertain. The courtiers who remained in the chamber continued their vigil, but the purpose had shifted. They were no longer watching over a dying king. They were marking the first moments of a kingdom without him. And with each passing second, the weight of that reality grew heavier. Louis XIV had been the center of gravity, the point around which France revolved. Now, without him, Versailles itself felt like a shell, its opulence revealing the void it had been built to conceal. In the gardens, a wind rose, stirring the still fountains and rustling the manicured hedges. It carried with it the toll of the bells, the sound scattering over the land like a warning. The sun was gone. What would rise in its place was yet unknown. And in the days that followed, as the black cloth was hung over Versailles and the body of the Sun King lay in state, the empire he had forged began to shift, not with the sudden crash of collapse, but with the slow, deliberate settling of power into new and often dangerous hands. The day after the Sun King's death, Versailles woke in a strange twilight. The palace still glittered. The mirrors still caught the light, but the air felt thinner, as if some unseen pressure had been lifted. For 72 years, the rhythm of this place had been set by one man's will, his waking, his movements, his commands. Now there was only silence, broken by the distant tolling of bells that seemed to ring not just for the dead king, but for the end of an entire order. In the Hall of Mirrors, black drapes were hung between the columns, their folds swallowing the light. The marble floors echoed differently without the familiar cadence of his steps. Outside, the great fountains lay still, their silence uncanny. The gardeners said the air itself seemed heavier, as though the absence of the king had reached even into the stone and water. His body lay in state in the royal chapel, embalmed and dressed in full regalia, the crown at his head, the scepter and hand of justice resting upon his chest. Candles surrounded him in thick ranks, their flames trembling in the drafts that whispered through the vaulted space. People came in a slow, unbroken procession to see him one last time. Some came in genuine grief. Old courtiers who had served him since their youth wept openly, their sobs echoing off the marble. Peasants from the surrounding villages filed past, heads bowed, murmuring prayers for the soul of the man who had been their king for longer than they had been alive. But others came with a different expression, a subtle lift of the chin, a glance that lingered a fraction too long. They came not to mourn, but to witness, to confirm with their own eyes that the sun had truly set and that the long shadow he had cast was at last lifting from the land. Paris too felt the shift. News of the king's death spread through the streets, passed from mouth to mouth, from market stalls to taverns. In some quarters, there was mourning. Church bells calling the faithful to mass, black cloth hung from windows. In others, there was only quiet curiosity, and in some, relief. For while Louis XIV had been a symbol of France's glory, he had also been the architect of its burdens, the wars, the taxes, the hunger in lean years. Back in Versailles, ministers moved quickly. The regency had to be secured, the young heir's position protected. In the council chambers, the talk was brisk and guarded, treaties, troop movements, the state of the treasury. But there was an unmistakable change in the atmosphere. Under Louis, decisions had been dictated by a single will. Now power flowed into many hands, each grasping to shape the kingdom according to their own vision or ambition. The heir himself, a boy barely old enough to hold a quill properly, seemed oblivious to the magnitude of what had happened. He played with his toy soldiers in the nursery while the adults argued over his future. Servants reported the clatter of miniature cannons and the soft thud of wooden horses as the child moved his armies across a small painted battlefield. In his world, the wars were simple, their outcomes predetermined. In the real France, things were not so easily controlled. Beyond France's borders, the news was received with quick impulses. In Vienna, in London, in Madrid, rivals and allies alike took the death of the Sun King as a signal. The great immovable presence that had dominated the continent was gone, and with him, the certainty he brought. Diplomats began to speculate on shifting alliances. Generals studied maps with fresh eyes. For some, it was an opportunity to challenge France's power. For others, a chance to bargain from a position of greater strength. At home, the people whispered of omens. In the days before his death, there had been sudden storms over the palace grounds, the sky boiling with dark clouds before clearing into unnervingly still air. Some swore they had seen a faint eclipse, a bite taken from the sun that lingered for hours. Others spoke of the fountains falling silent at the exact moment the king died, their stillness an unspoken acknowledgement from Versailles itself. The court wore black, the fabric heavy and rustling in the long corridors. Veils softened faces, but behind them, eyes glittered, not with tears, but with calculation. Change was coming, and those who had been bound by the gravity of Louis's rule were already adjusting their orbits. The morning rituals continued with precision. Each morning, the chapel was filled with the scent of incense and the low murmur of prayers. The choir sang solemn hymns that rose toward the vaulted ceiling, mingling with the light from the high stained glass windows. But even here, where grief should have been unclouded, there was an undercurrent of restlessness. People counted the days until the burial, not for closure, but because they knew that once the coffin was sealed in Saint-Denis, the political landscape would shift again. In the salons of Versailles, conversation grew bolder. The black-clad courtiers discussed the state of the army, the emptiness of the treasury, the need, or refusal, to continue certain wars. Old rivalries stirred, alliances formed in whispers. The death of the Sun King had not simply created a vacancy on the throne, it had broken the pattern of life in the court, and into that break, anything might pour. There was also the matter of memory. Already, talk began about how Louis XIV's reign would be remembered. Some insisted he would stand forever as the image of majesty, the embodiment of France's golden age. Others muttered of the famines, the endless taxes, the dead piled up in wars that had left the countryside scarred. In truth, both were accurate, and that duality would haunt his legacy. The palace itself seemed to shift under the change. Without the constant motion of the king's routine, the long galleries felt emptier, the mirrored walls reflecting not a living court, but an echo of what had been. The golden ceilings still shone, but without him beneath them, they seemed almost too heavy, as if the splendor was struggling to support itself. And yet, Versailles endured. The bells continued to toll at the appointed hours. The guards still changed shift with military precision. The great gates opened each morning to admit carriages and closed each night to keep the outside world at bay. But the unspoken truth lingered in every corner. The sun was gone, and the kingdom was turning without him. Somewhere in the depths of the palace, the young heir laughed as his toy soldiers fell in a mock battle. The sound drifted down a corridor, past a pair of ministers deep in whispered argument, and faded into the hum of a court that was neither fully mourning nor fully free. France was unmoored. Whether it would drift toward renewal or ruin remained uncertain. But for now, the empire without its son hovered in a strange, suspended state, part funeral, part rebirth. And beyond Versailles, beyond the politics and the whispers, the death of Louis XIV cast a shadow that reached across centuries, a reminder that even the brightest lights must fade, and that every throne sits under the same dark sky. Versailles still stands. Its mirrored halls still catch the morning light. Its gardens still unfurl in perfect geometry. Its fountains still leap into the air as if celebrating an eternal summer. But the man who once made this place the beating heart of Europe lies far from its splendor, sealed in a quiet tomb at Saint-Denis. His voice, once the law, is now only an echo. His gaze, once able to command armies, is only a memory etched into portraits. The death of Louis XIV was not merely the closing of a chapter in France's history. It was a mirror held up to the nature of power itself, a mirror that, even now, reflects truths too uncomfortable for rulers to ignore. For what was the Sun King's reign, if not a masterpiece of theater? Every gesture, every decree, every step through the Hall of Mirrors was staged to perfection. The crown was not just a symbol, it was a costume. Versailles was not just a palace, it was a set. And Louis himself was not just a king. He was the lead actor in the longest-running performance in European history. Yet behind the gold leaf and the silk curtains, the reality was always the same. Flesh weakens, blood fails, even the most exalted bodies decay. In the final act, the audience could see the truth bleeding through the costume, the pain behind the smile, the rot beneath the embroidered stockings. This is the paradox of monarchy, and perhaps of all power. It must appear immortal, even when it is at its most fragile. It must project certainty while privately negotiating with fear. It must outshine its own inevitable end. Louis XIV's last days were a study in that contradiction. The theater continued, the lever, the bows, the incense, the court's presence at his bedside. But the performance was slipping. The Sun King, who had defined himself through grandeur, was reduced to stillness, his world narrowed to the edge of his bed. And yet, even in that stillness, the performance had power. The courtiers came not only to witness his decline, but to measure themselves against it, to see how close they might stand to the center of the world before it went dark. But when the light finally went out, Versailles did not collapse. The walls did not crumble. The gardens did not wither. The mirrors still caught the sun. This too was part of the lesson. The machine of power survives the man, but it does not remain unchanged. Without him, the choreography faltered. The actors sought new roles. The plot took a different turn. And what of today? In every age, rulers drape themselves in ceremony. They stand on balconies to be cheered by crowds, walk red carpets under the eye of cameras, speak from gilded podiums framed by flags. The costumes have changed, but the principle is the same: to create an image so bright that the shadows cannot be seen. Yet the shadows are always there. Behind every throne, there are whispered rivalries. Behind every smiling portrait, there are private fears. Behind every promise of permanence, there is the quiet knowledge that nothing lasts forever. The splendor that hid the rot in 1715 is no different from the pageantry that masks uncertainty in the present. Louis XIV's death reminds us that the brightness of a reign is not measured solely by the light it casts, but also by the shadows it leaves behind. His rule brought France glory, yes, military victories, cultural dominance, the creation of Versailles itself. But it also brought exhaustion, empty coffers, war-worn fields, a populace strained by taxes and famine. The shadows were long, and when the light vanished, they seemed to grow longer still. That is why his end resonates across centuries. It is not simply the story of a monarch's decline. It is the story of the fragility of all human power. The Sun King's reign appeared unshakable, but it was always only one heartbeat away from silence. In the gardens of Versailles today, tourists stroll where nobles once conspired. They gaze into the reflecting pools where the king admired his own image. They stand in the Hall of Mirrors and see their faces multiplied endlessly, much as the king's image was once multiplied in the minds of his people. And perhaps, without realizing it, They participate in the same performance, marveling at the illusion, even as history whispers the truth beneath it. Because the true legacy of Louis XIV is not just the architecture, the paintings, or the wars. It is the reminder that power is a kind of light, brilliant, blinding, but never eternal. It can warm, but it can also burn. And no matter how high it rises, the day will come when it dips below the horizon. His tomb bears none of the theatricality of his life. There is no endless procession, no mirrored ceiling to reflect his grandeur. It is quiet, dimly lit, a place where footsteps echo and voices are hushed. The man who built Versailles, who made himself the sun, lies beneath cold stone. The costumes are gone. The stage is dark. Perhaps that is the final paradox. For all his efforts to be remembered as eternal, Louis XIV's truest lesson is one of impermanence, that even the brightest star is only one breath away from darkness. That history will judge not only how you lived, but how you faced the moment when the light began to fade. The Hall of Mirrors still reflects the sun, but it also reflects the shadows creeping in at the edges. In those shadows lies the truth about Louis XIV, about all rulers, about the nature of power itself. And so when we look at modern thrones, in palaces, in parliaments, in boardrooms, we should remember Versailles. We should remember the scent of incense failing to mask decay, the whispers outside the chamber doors, the gold leaf that could not hold back the night. Because the story of the Sun King's death is not just about a monarch from another century. It is about all who believe themselves untouchable, all who build their power on spectacle, all who forget that the sun always sets, no matter how brightly it burns. A slow pan through the Hall of Mirrors at dusk. The chandeliers are unlit. The mirrors catch the last orange light of day, and beyond the windows, the gardens are darkening. The voiceover lingers. In every age, the sun sets, and in the long shadows it leaves, history waits, watching.